The courtroom hummed, a low thrum of nervous energy vibrating through the air. Papers rustled like dry leaves caught in a desert wind. Whispers bounced off the high ceilings, a hushed chorus of speculation. Outside, a distant siren wailed, a fleeting reminder of the chaos beyond these walls. Inside, it was all held breaths and coiled tension. Judge Isabella Rodriguez sat on the bench, her dark eyes sharp and focused, a mask of professional detachment carefully in place. Just another day, another soul lost in the maze, she thought, trying to steel herself against the familiar wave of weary resignation. The state of Arizona versus DeShawn Williams, the bailiff's voice announced, the words echoing in the cavernous space. Izzy shifted, the leather of her chair sighing softly beneath her. The charges flickered on the screen before her. Assault, robbery, resisting. The usual sad trifecta. A dull ache pulsed behind her eyes, the familiar sting of disappointment. Another one caught in the gears, she thought. But then he was led in. And the carefully constructed world of Judge Rodriguez, the impartial dispenser of justice, shattered like a dropped glass. The man standing before her, wrists and ankles shackled, wasn't just another case file, another statistic. This was DeShawn. Sean, they used to call him. Sean, her childhood friend. Her throat constricted, a sudden tightness making it hard to breathe. Memories, sharp and vivid as desert lightning, flashed through her mind. Hot Tucson afternoons spent racing their beat-up bikes down dusty trails, the sun beating down on their backs. Late-night talks under the sprawling mesquite tree in her backyard, sharing secrets and dreams under the vast, starlit Arizona sky. Promises made, etched in the unwavering confidence of youth, to always have each other's backs. Through thick and thin, they'd vowed. But the man before her, this wasn't the Sean she remembered. This DeShawn had shoulders slumped with the weight of the world, his face etched with the harsh lines of a life lived on the edge. But his eyes, those deep-set, expressive eyes, the color of rich, dark earth, those were unmistakable. They were Sean's eyes, holding a universe of untold stories. Izzy's grip on the gavel, her symbol of order, of control, faltered. For the first time in her career, she hesitated. The courtroom, usually a vast, impersonal space, seemed to shrink, the walls closing in like a tightening fist. She felt trapped, suffocated by the sheer impossibility of it all. DeShawn looked up. His expression was a complex mix of emotions. Shock, resignation, and recognition? It flickered in his eyes, a brief, almost imperceptible spark, before he quickly averted his gaze, his head bowing slightly, as if in shame or perhaps surrender. The courtroom waited, a silent, expectant predator. Izzy forced herself to speak, her voice a strained whisper that amplified in the sudden hush. Mr. Williams, you stand accused of assault and robbery. How do you plead? His voice, when it came, was rough, gravelly, almost unrecognizable, the voice of a stranger speaking words she knew by heart. Not guilty, Your Honor. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of panic and disbelief. She wanted to stop the proceedings, to shout, "This is all wrong. I know him." She wanted to demand answers, to unravel the tangled threads of fate that had led them to this impossible crossroads. What happened to you, Sean? How did we end up here on opposite sides of this chasm? But the black robe, the weight of her office, the relentless gaze of the courtroom, they held her captive. Proceed, she managed, her voice steadier than she felt, a thin veneer of composure over a churning sea of inner turmoil. As the prosecutor, a slick, ambitious man named Richard "Rick" McKinley, began his opening statement, laying out the state's case with cold, calculated precision, Izzy's mind raced. This wasn't just another file. This was Sean. And somehow, she had to find a way to navigate this treacherous minefield, to separate the shattered fragments of her past from the stark realities of her present, before the weight of it all crushed her, and him, completely. It felt like trying to stop a desert wildfire with a single bucket of water. The courtroom, with its sterile formality, seemed to fade around Izzy. McKinley's voice, droning on about evidence and procedure, blurred into a distant, meaningless hum. Her mind was adrift, swept away on a current of memory, back to a time before the robes and the gavel, before the harsh realities of the world had hardened their hearts. She and Sean had grown up in different worlds, separated by the invisible, yet impenetrable boundaries of race and class in Tucson, Arizona. It wasn't about physical distance. It was about the unspoken rules, the subtle cues, the systemic barriers that kept their communities apart. Her family lived in a comfortable, Spanish-style home in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood. Sean's family lived in a small, run-down house on the other side of the tracks, a neighborhood where hope often felt like a luxury. Their friendship had been a rebellion, a quiet defiance of the unspoken codes that governed their town. She remembered their first meeting with a startling clarity. It was an accident, a chance encounter at a local park, where she'd gone with her family for a picnic. Sean had been playing basketball, his movements fluid and graceful, his laughter echoing across the court. She'd been drawn to his energy, his infectious joy, his easy confidence. They'd started talking, and that simple conversation had blossomed into a friendship that felt both natural and forbidden. "Izzy," he'd said to her once, lying on their backs in a patch of shade, staring up at the vast, cloudless Arizona sky. "You ever think about getting out of this town? Like really leaving? Going somewhere where people don't give you the side eye just 'cause you're hangin' with someone who don't look like you?" She'd laughed it off then, dismissing it as teenage angst. But Sean hadn't been joking. Even as a kid, he'd seen the world for what it was, a place where the color of your skin could determine your destiny, where opportunities weren't always equal, where justice often wore a blindfold that seemed to favor some over others. Their bond deepened despite the whispers, the disapproving glances, the outright hostility from some corners. They were like two magnets, drawn together by an irresistible force, defying the gravity of their divided town. But the pressure was always there, a constant simmering tension, like the heat radiating off the desert pavement in the middle of summer. And then one day it all shattered. It was the summer before high school, that fragile, transitional time when childhood innocence begins to crumble under the weight of adult realities. Her abuelo, her grandfather, a man who prided himself on being open-minded, but who also believed in knowing your place, had found them sitting on the porch swing together, sharing a soda and laughing. His voice had been like a whip crack, sharp and cold, shattering the easy intimacy of the moment. "Isabella, get inside. Ahora." She'd hesitated, glancing at Sean, who stood frozen, his face a mask of stoic resignation. He knew the drill. "Go on," he'd said softly, his voice barely a whisper, tinged with a sadness that had pierced her heart. "It's all good. I'll see you around." But they hadn't seen each other around. Not really. Her abuelo had forbidden her from seeing Sean, and soon after, with a suddenness that felt like a betrayal, Sean's family had moved away, vanished, like a mirage in the desert heat. Rumor had it they'd gone to California, seeking a fresh start, a place where they wouldn't be constantly reminded of the limitations imposed upon them by their skin color. Izzy had buried herself in her studies, channeling her grief and confusion into academic excellence. She'd excelled, driven by a fierce determination to escape Tucson, to prove herself, to make a difference in the world. She'd gone to law school, chasing the elusive ideal of justice, of equality, of a world where everyone had a fair shot, regardless of their background. But she'd never forgotten Sean, the boy who had taught her about courage, about resilience, about the quiet strength that it takes to stand up for what you believe in, even when the whole world is telling you to stand down. Now, sitting on the bench, the weight of her judge's robes feeling heavier than ever, she wondered what had happened to Sean after that day, after she'd walked into that house and closed the door on their childhood friendship. His record, a cold, impersonal document, showed a string of arrests for minor offenses: petty theft, loitering, disorderly conduct. Nothing that suggested a violent criminal, nothing that hinted at the charges he now faced. But then again, how much of a person's life could you really glean from a few lines on a rap sheet? It was like trying to understand the desert by looking at a single grain of sand. McKinley's voice, sharp and insistent, finally broke through the fog of her memories, pulling her back to the present. He was describing the alleged crime, painting a picture of DeShawn as a dangerous, desperate man who had assaulted a store clerk, Mr. Garcia, during a robbery at a convenience store in Phoenix. Mr. Garcia had suffered minor injuries, and the cash register had been emptied. DeShawn had been apprehended a few blocks away, the cash allegedly still in his possession. It was a neat, tidy narrative, all wrapped up in a bow of circumstantial evidence. Izzy studied DeShawn as McKinley spoke. His posture was still slumped, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, but his expression was unreadable. He was wearing a mask, hiding his true feelings behind a wall of carefully constructed indifference. Did he really do it? The question gnawed at her, a persistent, unsettling doubt. Or was there more to the story? Layers of complexity that the prosecution's neat narrative conveniently overlooked? Was this a hardened criminal, or a desperate man cornered by circumstance? The courtroom adjourned for a lunch recess, a brief respite from the mounting tension. It felt like a momentary pause in a hurricane. Izzy needed time to think, to try and reconcile the Sean she remembered with the man accused of these violent acts. As she retreated to her chambers, her assistant, Elena, a young woman with a sharp mind and a compassionate heart, approached her cautiously. "Judge Rodriguez, are you okay? You seem distracted," Elena said, her voice filled with genuine concern. Izzy hesitated. Should she confide in Elena? Would it be a breach of ethics, a betrayal of her judicial impartiality, to admit that she knew the defendant, that her past was intertwined with his present? The rules of engagement were clear: objectivity, detachment, a blind eye to anything outside the four corners of the evidence. But this wasn't just another case. It was a collision of two worlds, a reckoning with a past she thought she'd buried. Instead, she offered a weak smile, a practiced mask of composure. "I'm fine, Elena. Just a lot to process. A lie, a necessary lie perhaps, but a lie nonetheless." But she wasn't fine. How could she be? The past she'd worked so hard to suppress, to lock away in a forgotten corner of her memory, was now sitting just a few feet away, in chains, his fate hanging in the balance, dependent on her judgment. Felt like a cruel twist of fate, a cosmic joke with a devastating punchline. The courtroom was packed when the trial resumed, a sea of faces, a gallery of judgment. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, their pens scratching like frantic insects. Mr. Garcia, looking pale and shaken, shifted nervously in the witness stand. And Rick McKinley, the prosecutor, was a coiled viper, ready to strike, to deliver his carefully crafted narrative of guilt. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," McKinley began, his voice resonating with the practiced confidence of a seasoned performer. "This case is about violence. It's about a man who walked into a convenience store and, without provocation, attacked an innocent clerk before stealing the money. The evidence will show, beyond any reasonable doubt, that DeShawn Williams is guilty of this crime." He spoke with the smooth, calculated cadence of a salesman pitching a product, his words designed to persuade, to convince, to condemn. Izzy felt a knot tighten in her stomach. McKinley's tone was so detached, so impersonal, as if DeShawn were nothing more than a case number, a statistic, an abstraction. He was dehumanizing him, reducing him to a caricature of a criminal. She glanced at DeShawn, whose gaze remained fixed on the table before him, his expression a blank canvas onto which the jury could project their own biases and fears. Sophia Chun, the defense attorney, rose to present her opening statement. She was young, but there was a quiet intensity in her eyes, a fierce determination that belied her age. Her voice, though not as booming as McKinley's, carried across the room with a calm, unwavering authority. The prosecution would have you believe this case is simple, cut and dried. But it's not. It's far more complex than they'd like you to believe, she stated, her voice resonating with conviction. My client, DeShawn Williams, maintains his innocence. We will show that there is another side to this story, that the assumptions made on the night of the arrest are flawed, and that the evidence itself is far from conclusive. This isn't about proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. It's about demonstrating that reasonable doubt exists. The first witness was called Mr. Garcia, the store clerk who had allegedly been assaulted. He described, in hesitant, nervous tones, seeing a man matching DeShawn's description enter the store, argue with him, and then lunge over the counter, grabbing at the cash register. His testimony was detailed, but it felt scripted, like a story he'd been told to tell, a narrative he'd rehearsed. There was a lack of genuine conviction, a subtle hesitation that made Izzy uneasy. Sophia Chen's cross-examination was like a laser beam, focused, precise, and aimed at exposing the weaknesses in the witness's account. Mr. Garcia, you stated that the man who attacked you was wearing a dark hoodie. Is that correct? Yes, the witness replied, avoiding eye contact. Did you get a good look at his face? Not really. It was dark and, the hoodie was up. It all happened so fast. Sophia nodded slowly, pacing deliberately in front of the jury box. So, you're saying you couldn't positively identify the individual who committed the assault? Well, no, but Mr. Garcia stammered, his voice trailing off. No further questions, Sophia said, cutting him off with a decisive gesture. It was a small victory, but a crucial one. She'd created a crack in the prosecution's foundation. Izzy noticed DeShawn shift slightly in his seat, his shoulders seeming to straighten just a fraction, as if Sophia's words had offered him a glimmer of hope, a tiny spark of light in the gathering darkness. The next piece of evidence was the surveillance video from the store. It was grainy, poorly lit, a blurry jumble of shadows and movement. It showed a figure in a dark hoodie entering the store, a brief scuffle at the counter, and then the figure fleeing. The prosecution argued that this figure was undeniably DeShawn Williams. But the quality of the video was so poor, so ambiguous, that it was impossible to discern any identifying features. Could have been anyone. It was like trying to identify a specific star in a vast, undifferentiated galaxy. As the video played, Izzy studied it intently, her brow furrowed in concentration. Could this really be Sean? The figure moved quickly with a kind of desperate urgency, grabbing at the counter before disappearing off-screen. The footage ended abruptly, leaving a gaping void in the narrative, an unanswered question that hung in the air like a shroud. DeShawn's defense was based on an alibi. He claimed he'd been at a friend's house, several blocks away, at the time of the robbery. The friend, however, was reluctant to testify, citing personal reasons, a vague excuse that, Izzy suspected, masked a fear of getting involved, of becoming entangled in the messy machinery of the justice system. Sophia argued that the absence of a corroborating witness didn't automatically invalidate DeShawn's claim of innocence. But the jury's expressions, a mixture of skepticism and suspicion, suggested they weren't entirely persuaded. It was an uphill battle, a struggle against a system that often seemed predisposed to assume guilt, especially when the defendant was a young black man. As the trial progressed, Izzy felt the weight of her position, the crushing responsibility of her role, pressing down on her like a physical force. She was supposed to be impartial, a neutral arbiter, a blindfolded Lady Justice holding the scales of truth. But how could she be impartial when every moment, every testimony, every piece of evidence was a painful reminder of her shared past with the defendant? The boy who had once been her friend, her confidant, her partner in childhood adventures, was now a man fighting for his freedom, his future, and she was the one who held his fate in her hands. It was a cruel paradox, a burden almost too heavy to bear. When court adjourned for the day, the setting sun cast long, distorted shadows across the courtroom, mirroring the growing uncertainty within Izzy. She lingered at the bench, her fingers tracing the smooth, worn edges of the gavel. The wood cool beneath her touch. It felt less like a symbol of authority and more like an anchor, grounding her in the midst of a swirling storm of emotions and conflicting loyalties. She longed to talk to DeShawn, to look him in the eye, to ask him, point blank, what really happened that night, but she couldn't. Any contact outside the formal parameters of the courtroom would be a violation, a breach of ethics that could jeopardize the entire case, destroy her career, and, worst of all, further compromise DeShawn's chances. It was a legal and ethical quagmire. As she watched DeShawn being escorted out of the room, the clinking of his shackles a stark reminder of his confinement, a wave of frustration, of powerlessness, washed over her. She'd always believed in the justice system, in its capacity to uncover the truth, to separate fact from fiction, to deliver fair and impartial outcomes. But for the first time, she found herself questioning that belief, wondering if the truth was something too elusive, too subjective, too easily manipulated by those in power. It was the defense's turn to present their case, and Sophia Chun wasted no time in challenging the prosecution's narrative. She called her first key witness, Officer Kevin O'Connell, the arresting officer. This was where the carefully constructed edifice of the prosecution's case might begin to crumble. Izzy leaned forward slightly, her gaze intense, her senses on high alert. Officer O'Connell, a stocky man with a brusque manner and a world-weary air, took the stand, radiating a kind of cynical detachment. He looked like he'd seen it all, and none of it had impressed him. Sophia approached him with a calm, deliberate demeanor, a quiet confidence that was more effective than any bluster. Officer O'Connell, she began, her voice clear and steady. You were the arresting officer in this case, correct? That's right, he replied, his tone curt, almost dismissive. You stated in your report that Mr. Williams was walking a few blocks from the scene of the robbery when you apprehended him. Is that correct? Yeah. And what led you to believe he was the suspect? O'Connell shifted in his seat, his eyes flickering towards the prosecution table. He fit the description. Black male, mid-20s, wearing dark clothing. It was the same predictable response. The same lazy profiling that had condemned countless young black men before DeShawn. Sophia's eyebrows arched slightly, a subtle expression of incredulity. Dark clothing? But the suspect in the video, the one Mr. Garcia described, was wearing a dark hoodie. Did you find a dark hoodie in Mr. Williams's possession when you searched him? O'Connell hesitated, his jaw tightening. No, but he could have dumped it, tossed it somewhere. Sophia took a step closer, her voice taking on a sharper edge. Coulda? Did you, or any other officer, conduct a thorough search of the surrounding area to locate this supposedly discarded hoodie? O'Connell's face reddened slightly, his composure beginning to fray. Nah, we didn't have time for that. We cuffed him quick. Case closed. He sounded defensive, as if justifying his actions to himself as much as to the court. Sophia pressed on, her voice relentless. So, to clarify, Officer O'Connell, you arrested my client based on a vague, generalized description, without any concrete physical evidence linking him to the scene of the crime? You basically saw a young black man walking down the street and decided he was your guy. The officer's silence was deafening. It hung in the air, a damning indictment of his actions, of his biases, of the systemic prejudices that permeated the entire criminal justice system. It was the kind of silence that spoke volumes, that shouted injustice louder than any protest. Izzy's gaze shifted to the jury. Several members were exchanging uneasy glances, their faces reflecting a growing sense of doubt, of discomfort. The seeds of suspicion that Sophia had planted were beginning to germinate. Sophia wasn't finished. Officer O'Connell, do you recall if Mr. Williams said anything at the time of his arrest? Yeah, he said the usual crap. I didn't do it. You got the wrong guy. They all say that. And did you, at any point, consider investigating his claim, exploring the possibility that he might, in fact, be innocent? Or did you simply assume his guilt, based solely on his appearance, on the color of his skin. It was a loaded question, a direct challenge to the officer's integrity, to the very foundations of his police work. O'Connell's face was now a mask of anger and defiance. "I followed procedure," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "Procedure?" Sophia repeated, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Or prejudice?" "No further questions, Your Honor." The courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations as Officer O'Connell stepped down, his credibility severely damaged, his testimony leaving a gaping hole in the prosecution's case. Izzy's heart pounded in her chest. This was more than just a trial now. It was an indictment of a flawed system, a system that too often prioritized expediency over justice, assumptions over evidence, a system that seemed all too willing to condemn DeShawn Williams, not because of what he'd done, but because of who he was. It was a reckoning, not just for DeShawn, but for everyone in that courtroom, including herself. The defense's next move was a strategic gamble, a calculated attempt to further dismantle the prosecution's case. Sophia Chun called an expert witness, Dr. Emily Carter, a forensic analyst specializing in video enhancement and image analysis. This was a direct challenge to the prosecution's seemingly irrefutable evidence, the blurry, ambiguous surveillance footage. Dr. Carter, a woman with a sharp mind and an unwavering focus, explained, in clear, accessible language, the inherent limitations of the video. She pointed out the poor lighting, the low resolution, the grainy texture, all of which made it impossible to definitively identify the individual in the dark hoodie. "Based on my analysis," she stated, her voice calm and authoritative, "there is simply no way to conclusively determine, with any degree of scientific certainty, that the person in this video is Mr. Williams. The height, the build, the gait, they're all within a range of possibilities, but they're not unique. It's like trying to identify someone from their silhouette. You can make inferences, but you can't be certain." But Dr. Carter had uncovered something even more significant. The timestamp on the video, the digital marker that indicated the precise time of the recording, had been subtly altered. It was a minor manipulation, a digital tweak that could easily have gone unnoticed, but it raised serious questions about the integrity of the entire video, about its admissibility as evidence. "The metadata," she explained, referring to the embedded information within the video file, clearly shows that the timestamp was modified after the initial recording. This strongly suggests that the video may have been tampered with, possibly to make it align with the prosecution's timeline. The courtroom erupted in a chorus of gasps and murmurs. The prosecution, clearly caught off guard, attempted to dismiss Dr. Carter's testimony as speculative nonsense, baseless conjecture. But the damage was done. The seed of doubt had not only sprouted, it had grown into a full-blown tree of suspicion, its branches casting a long shadow over the entire case. The jury looked visibly shaken, their confidence in the prosecution's evidence significantly eroded. As the day drew to a close, the pivotal moment arrived. DeShawn Williams, against the advice of his own attorney, made the decision to take the stand. It was a high-risk maneuver, a desperate attempt to reclaim his narrative, to tell his side of the story, to connect with the jury on a human level. Sophia had warned him of the dangers, of the potential for the prosecution to twist his words, to exploit his past mistakes, but DeShawn was resolute. He wanted to be heard. He stood, the chains clinking softly as he approached the stand, a sound that seemed to accentuate the silence in the room. His voice, though quiet, carried a raw, unvarnished sincerity, a palpable sense of desperation. He wasn't polished or eloquent like the lawyers. He spoke in the plain, direct language of a man who had nothing left to lose. "I've made mistakes in my life," he began, looking directly at the jury, his eyes meeting theirs one by one. "I ain't gonna front about that. I've hung out with the wrong crowd, made some bad calls, done some dumb shit. I've been down on my luck, scraped the bottom more times than I care to admit. But I didn't do this. I'm not a violent person. I'm not a thief." He paused, taking a deep breath, his chest heaving with emotion. "That night, I was at my boy's place chillin', watching the game. It was late, and I was just walking home, minding my own business. That's all. And then, the cops stopped me. They didn't ask me no questions. They didn't give me a chance to explain nothing. They just saw a young black dude walking down the street, and they figured I was guilty. They profiled me,